Welcome to this Asia Global podcast, brought to you by the Asia Global Institute at the University of Hong Kong. I'm your host, Alejandro Reyes, the Institute's Director of Knowledge Dissemination. In our programs here in Hong Kong and online, and in the content that we produce, we focus on presenting Asian perspectives on global issues. This podcast is part of our Meet the Author series, where we have a conversation with contributors to Asia Global Online and other publications of the Institute. Joining me now from Stanford University in Palo Alto, California, is Yvonne Chiu. She is a National Fellow at the Hoover Institution of Stanford and a professor at the US Naval War College. Her book, Conspiring with the Enemy, The Ethic of Cooperation in Warfare, won the North American Society for Social Philosophy Book Award in 2019 and the International Studies Association International Ethics Section Book Award in 2021. More personally, Yvonne was a colleague of mine when she taught here at the University of Hong Kong. She was a great teacher and a very supportive colleague. So now let me just stress here that the views that Yvonne expresses in her article and here in this discussion are hers alone and do not reflect those of her institutions. Yvonne, welcome. So lovely to see you.
Thanks for having me. I'm very happy to be talking to you.
Great, thank you very much. Now, in your article, you note that efforts are being made to regulate cyber warfare or to prevent cyber attacks from escalating into traditional war. And of course, we've seen reports over the years, attacks from China, attacks on the United States, attacks from China, attacks from North Korea, Russia, many different kinds of attacks. Now, however, you argue that the discussions that are going on about whether cyber attacks should be considered war or how the law of armed conflict should apply to cyber warfare, that all of these discussions will prove ineffective or futile without a shared understanding between enemies about a fundamental question. Is cyber warfare not just sort of a catchy slogan like war on poverty or war on Christmas, or is it actually warfare? So I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that debate. Where is it going on, and is it really going on in a meaningful way, this particular debate?
Yeah, so this is a really important debate, and I think it's not being tackled directly enough, partly because the people who are discussing it are mostly in the business of conducting war or trying to prevent war. And basically, when you're in that position, you're just automatically thrown into a situation which you're trying to cope with what's coming at you. And if there's a cyber attack coming, you're not going to pause and think about, well, is this war I'm dealing with? Is this not war? You're just going to try to respond. And so, so it's just the nature of having to deal with the immediate activity and immediate threats that you're not going to have the luxury of being able to step back and wrestle with the broader conceptual question. But the point of this this essay that I wrote was to try to get other people who are not as busy dealing with the immediate cyber threats and immediate cyber activity to think about what it is that we're doing. And it makes it it makes a big difference whether we think of something is war or not war, because there's a whole body, a massive and very, very well-developed body of international law that governs war, that does in a very different way than it governs criminal activity, right? And it's something that we need to work out when you're thinking about it. It affects the way you respond to cyber activity, whether you think it's war or not war, and it will also affect the way that you want to conduct cyber activity.
Right. Now, in your article, I think it's so well organized because you start by talking about, well, what do we mean by war, right? And I think you also you talk about some of the Chinese writings on this issue. I want you to talk about that. Well, what do we mean by war, and you know, what is the kind of what is the concept? I mean, people think of it generally as kinetic wars, right? There's really force and military action, but you really discuss this topic and talk about the possible broader conception of war.
Yeah, so as you said, the traditional concept of war is kinetic, right? It's physical activity. You're fighting someone, you're physically beating someone, or killing people, or destroying, physical objects or people. But there's a broader conception of war, which accompanies that kinetic definition of war. It includes diplomacy around all of this kinetic activity, intelligence gathering, propaganda, and a question. And one of the interesting things about asking specifically what those boundaries, how broad the boundary of war is because a lot of this discussion of cyber warfare is taking place around the US-China competitive relationship. And especially, on Western military scholars and planners are always drawn to classical Chinese writings on military ethics. And one of the things that gets taught a lot is Shunzi's conception of, and it's not original to Shunzi. Taigong talks about it as well. The ideal in warfare is to defeat the enemy without fighting, right? And what does this actually mean? And I think it's something. So one, there are a couple questions here to deal with. One is, the first question is of course, does the Chinese military actually adhere to these classical conceptions of warfare, or is this something that's a part of the past history, but doesn't influence its thinking so much now? Two, if it does influence its thinking, then the question is, what does this aphorism, what's become an aphorism, winning without fighting, what does this actually mean, right? Can you actually defeat another country? Can you defeat its military without engaging in kinetic interactions? And what would that require? This then becomes a very relevant question for cyber war. There's, I think, cyber war can sometimes be held out as an ideal of, a way of winning a war without fighting. But I'm not so sure that that's actually possible.
I mean, so when people think of cyber attacks, they think about, Russian intervention in the election, or I guess hacks that try to get into government agencies, things like that, and we've seen recent examples of that. So yes, I mean, people will say, well, are these really attacks meant that are equivalent to warfare, or in the sense that they want to achieve some kind of victory, if you will, or are they simply ways to hamper, or in other words, espionage that maybe we've seen before through the many years, that they're just simply meant to get information or hamper the smooth running of government in some way, right? The kind of James Bond things that one might have expected. How would you explain this then? Because it's a kind of weird way. How would you calibrate it? In other words, what would you use? What sort of I'm getting a little lost for words, but what kind of calibrations would you use to sort of define when a cyber attack is cyber warfare?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a difficult question. And I think that's something I don't have the answer for. That's something that the answer can only, but I do think the answer can only be developed. Has to be developed in conjunction with discussion. So, I mean, I as a political theorist can sit here and come up with these abstract categories, right? But basically there are things that are very clearly warfare, I think. Cyber attacks, I think they're very clearly should be considered warfare. So anything that's directly in the service of a physical attack, right?
Right.
Disabling radar systems so that you can send in a bomber or something, right? Then there's stuff that is very, I think, more obviously not an act of warfare. So, for example, just a hack that steals a bunch of personal information, right, with an unspecified use and unclear purpose. So that I would call, but there is a gradient between competition, geopolitical competition and warfare. And so I think it's pretty clear what is warfare, what's not warfare, but this whole middle zone in the middle, that we're not so sure about that. And what I do think is that where that line is drawn is going to require all sorts of discussion with people who are actually engaged in these activities, in these competitive activities. And two, it will also depend on the context of the existing geopolitical relationship. You can imagine a cyber attack from an ally, and let's face it, allies are still in competition with each other geopolitically. A cyber attack from an ally having a very different meaning, having very different geopolitical meaning than one from a competitor or a more obvious competitor.
So this actually hews to the topic of your book, right? Because you're talking here that, okay, we can't come up with a kind of framework for understanding when cyber attacks are equivalent to warfare, unless there's some actual discussion, in some ways, about among the enemies, among the adversaries, right? So what are the ethics of cooperation between enemies in warfare? Because here comes a real example of where there should be some kind of cooperation between enemies. And you deal with that in your book so masterfully. So why don't you talk a bit about that issue?
Okay, yeah. So just as a segue, I think the depressing part about this whole cyber, trying to conceptualize cyber warfare is that we're going to be unsuccessful at it unless we fight a lot of it. And that's just the reality. And I think part of the desire to try to get some categories in place and to try to get some rules in place now is to prevent some of the fighting, cyber warfare, to try to constrain it more, minimize its damage. But the fact is that any kind of equilibrium that will emerge will have to be done at least in part through fighting and seeing how things actually shake out. So that's the depressing part of it. So then, related to the book, so I argue that there is that in the course of all of the fighting that human beings have done over millennia, that an ethic of cooperation has risen up, has grown in warfare, kind of counterintuitively. You don't think of warfare as a place as an activity in which enemies actually cooperate with each other while they're trying to kill each other, right? So these are not, allies or enemies who decide to work together to defeat a mutual third-party enemy. They're actually trying to kill each other now, but still cooperating on a variety of things. And so, and that this cooperation itself it grows out of lots of different motivations, mostly self-interest, but also gets imbued with humanitarian meaning, considerations, human rights, various other things. And that over time, the reason it's an ethic of cooperation is that people begin to perceive the cooperation itself as being the right thing to do. And so I talk about three different types of cooperation in the book. One is cooperating with your enemy to have a fair fight. And this might involve banning certain types of weapons when you're trying to kill your enemy because it's seen as being dishonorable or unfair, unsoldierly. You don't want even an enemy. You don't want a fellow warrior to die in an ignoble way. So that's one way of cooperating. The other is to cooperate to protect certain classes of people, most famously civilians, but also lots of other examples, medics, religious leaders, and political leaders of various kinds. And then the third method of cooperation which is much rarer, is to cooperate to try to end a war quickly. This usually happens under circumstances of relative, or actually not relative, of scarcity, right? You have, scarce population, small population, enormous demands on their time, for example, with in certain types of agricultural societies, and you don't have the resources to spend fighting extended, unlimited wars, and so you want to constrain the amount of time you spend fighting. You want to constrain the losses of war, so you can get back to to other activities, the more important activities in your life, which is surviving, right? Growing your crops, harvesting them, cultivating your society. So those are kind of three different types, and I talk about a lot of different examples and a lot of the problems as well. The benefits and of pursuing these types of cooperation, but also in many cases a lot of the problems, and then the contradictions between them, because they all kind of exist at the same time, but they don't always go together.
So as a complete sort of layman to these things, I guess when you think about enemies cooperating, things like the Geneva Conventions, stuff like that, and then there has to be a certain level of trust, right, and involved, but that can often be skin deep, if you will. It can be very, very superficial levels of trust, and then behind the scenes, things are not being done according to those conventions. One often thinks of people who go by the so-called Queensberry rules, of proper engagement and sportsmanship, but yet if your opponent professes to go to conduct themselves according to those rules, but behind the scenes does not, then there becomes a kind of asymmetric relationship there. So I would think that it's building that level of trust to ensure that there is that kind of cooperation on a framework would be very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve in an arena such as cyber attacks, because everything is kind of behind the scenes. You don't see physical injuries, or you don't see, there are things that are happening in cyberspace. So how can just like a layman kind of come to terms with this idea then?
So yeah, you're absolutely right. I think building trust. So I'll start with some of the things that make cooperation between enemies possible, and then talk about why it is that cyber war is going to be especially difficult. So some of the things that make cooperation between enemies possible is being actually physically encountering each other, right? And then you can either you see that your enemy is not as monstrous as you thought they were. You see that perhaps maybe your own commanding officers, making bad decisions and putting you in danger, or it's actually perhaps more of your enemy than the guy who's across the line from you, who's also just trying to survive. It could be that you have been trained with a sense of warrior honor and military professionalism, and that your opponent also has received similar training, and so you come to the table with similar ideas about what a warrior is, what a military person is, and the types of things they're supposed to do. And so that is a kind of similarity between the two. It doesn't require direct interaction between them, but you have parallel types of training and education, right? And this of course requires enforcement. That's actually a lot of the tricky part about many tricky things about the international law and military ethics is that there's not that much in the way of international enforcement on violations of military law. It does require mostly that sovereign states enforce the international law on their own service members, which they are often very reluctant to do because they don't want to punish their own service members doing things that might have helped them win. So there's that, but all of these things then make it's obvious why that would be difficult to enforce in cyber warfare. But that person-to-person connection, which is kind of the foundation of a lot of cooperation between enemies in war, it is necessarily missing in cyber warfare. And I think that's going. So actually, two things are missing. One is the potential for personal interactions, and the second is, I think, the conception of warriordom or warriorhood. And this is a broader problem, I think, for militaries as they become more and more technologically advanced. Militaries, as you develop the technological capacity, the first thing you want to do is put more distance between yourself and the enemy, for obvious reasons, right? But and you're usually doing that with technology, and you also develop technology that has that relies more on technological skill as opposed to warrior skill. And so the question, and so for example, things like drone pilots, right, where you're doing these strikes, aerial strikes on targets that are very far away, sometimes up to 7,000 miles away from you. Now, so the military I'm most familiar with is the US military. The US military to this point is still using trained pilots to conduct these drone strikes. And there are really good reasons for that. You want them to be able to understand things like, the aeronautics of flying, and that's really important. But at some point, well, there's a trade-off, right? Because all these pilots who spend a lot of time training to be pilots are not necessarily gaining the perhaps some of the spending the time gaining some of the skills they might need to be better at drone piloting and these remote airstrikes. So at some point there comes a trade-off between these skills. Now, well, there may come a day in which you have the drone pilots not be trained fighter pilots or other types of pilots. They might be engineers, they might be people who grew up playing video games, right? So will they have that same warrior ethic that they can bring to the table? And I think that's a concern for this idea of cooperating with the enemy, being able to reach some kind of stable equilibrium about how you fight your war. It's going to have to come from other sources than the idea of a professional warrior. And it's going to be a big shift in the way it could potentially, it could potentially be a big shift in the way parts of the military thinks of itself and parts of how it does its training.
This is really fascinating because, indeed in your article, you talk about how cyber activity raises the question of these targeted killings with drones, and what does that mean in terms of the definition of a battlefield, right? What is a zone of combat, and should war be confined to a particular battlefield?
Oh wait, sorry, I lost you for just a second. Could you go back about 30 seconds?
Yeah, no worries. It's fascinating because you bring up drones, and in your article, indeed, you talk about targeted killings with drones, and how this raises questions about, what is a battlefield? When is one in a zone of combat? Should war be confined to the battlefield? And when can one legitimately kill off the battlefield? Who is a legitimate target, and under what circumstances? All very kind of difficult, new, I guess, ethical questions that are raised by this kind of technological these technological advances. But in cyber activity, you say also raises its own distinct questions. Can non-physical conflict alone count as war? Can one really win a war without using force? This idea of the ideal of war, winning without fighting. So I'm wondering then, what does this mean going forward? Given, I I sometimes have visions of, are we going to be fighting wars that are simulated on computer, or like virtual wars, and have some agreements as to, like, we won't have real casualties, and we'll just have a simulated war that's run by competing AIs, and then whatever the results of the war, we're all going to, it'd be like, playing chess or something like that. I don't know. And so I'm wondering what all this means in practice, if we're heading towards a technological kind of world, an even more hyper technological world.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it means that in the short run, we're in a world of trouble because we have all of these unsettled questions already from, remote targeted attacks. And then all those questions are relevant to cyber warfare, plus, these unique ones about whether you can win without kinetic fighting. And I think, to your, to the question of, what does the future of war look like? I don't think that we ultimately will be fighting wars without, these entirely virtual wars, and for the reason that that anybody who loses a virtual war or a virtual battle always has the option of defecting from this agreement, right? And to honor the terms of, to honor the outcome of this virtual battle and move to physical battle. And someone will always be willing to do that. So, and I think the higher the stakes get, the more likely it is that a country or, a military unit of some kind will be willing to do that, because you always want to look for another way to win, right? And if you are only fighting virtual battles, then you have not exhausted all of your options. So I think that's just the reality of it. And there have been these interesting, sci-fi examples of why it doesn't work, right? And so, I mean, sometimes if you've read Ender's Game, where he thinks he's playing a video game, but it turns out, and then he wins, but it turns out actually, in fact, he was controlling real troops. And so ultimately, you have to be controlling real forces to win. There's also that wild Star Trek episode in the original series, if you've seen that one.
I remember that one where then the number of calculated casualties have to go, kill themselves, right? Report to be exterminated.
Yeah. And so, and the reason they do that is because people wouldn't agree to any of the outcomes otherwise in the long run, right? I mean, it doesn't give the entire back history about how this system developed, but I would imagine that that probably at some point they would have tried an entirely virtual war, but nobody's going to stick to that agreement forever.
Do you anticipate that there can be some kind of global global discussion on a framework on cyber warfare that can actually yield some kind of framework for all of this and rules of engagement, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, I think there can be. There are already attempts to do so. The Talon manual has gone through, already has a revised version out. So there's a lot of effort to do this, and I think it's an important thing to do because you do want to get it. It's you don't want the ethics to always be lagging so far behind the activity, especially when we can already foresee a lot of the ethical problems. So I think in that sense, developing certain types of constraints and ethics around cyber warfare will happen more easily than perhaps some of the ethics that have been developed around other types of warfare earlier in our history. But the real challenge is that cyber warfare is still very new. And I think there's so much that we don't know about, not just what we can do, right? We're always going to develop new things that we're capable of, but also just what the effects really are going to be of different types of cyber attacks. And they have enormous ramifications, because now you're talking about ramifications in every single sector of a society. And we have no real conception yet of the breadth of those impacts.
Now, there are those who are arguing that, in terms of defense spending, and I think I've heard this certainly in the United States, that there should be a real shift away from spending on physical assets and much more on preparations for cyber warfare, cyber attacks, and preparations for greater cybersecurity. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, is this something that is gaining currency, or is it still like too early to say that this is, it's time that we've seriously thought about it?
Yeah, I mean that idea is always around in some form.
Right.
And so, for example, a couple of decades ago, there was the little revolution of military affairs, right? So there's always this push to try to shift resources to more technologically advanced military activity. And I think that's really important. You don't want to, you want to be the leader in the military technology always. But I think, so actually my squishy answer on this is actually all militaries have enormous waste in their spending. And I think actually what they should be doing, instead of trying to, what would be more effective is, instead of trying to claw more money out, more total amounts of money out for a military budget, is to become much more efficient about the military spending that's already being done. You can shift a lot of resources over to the new technology simply from all the waste that's being generated from the existing spending. Now, that's the hard way of doing it, because it's easier to lobby for sexy new technology. But that's really the way it should be done. There's no reason that we can't have a very robust physical, robust and prepared physical military while pursuing a lot of the new technological and cyber capacity.
Right. Now, let's move on to talking about your current research and your next book on, I think you're looking at authoritarianism. What's it about?
Yeah, so this next book project is totally different. So we'll see. It'll be a test of my abilities. I'm looking at soft authoritarianism as a model in East Asia, Hong Kong mostly, but also in East Asia, looking at the ways in which it differs from some of the soft authoritarianism we're more familiar with internationally, and also some of the unique challenges and dangers of authoritarianism here. Or sorry, there, I'm no longer here.
Yeah, interesting, because my undergraduate thesis was on the concept of constitutional authoritarianism. The idea that you could, within constitutional framework, introduce sort of authoritarian practices, or somehow rationalize authoritarian approach using constitutional means. Right?
Okay, so you were very prescient, because this is all the rage right now.
Yeah, no. So I also did that at master's level too, focusing on, at that time, the Philippines and in Singapore. So I find this fascinating, because I think in some ways a constitutional authoritarian system may even be the trickier to deal with if you're someone who wants to have greater freedom or express themselves, whatever, because in some ways it's a weaponization of ambiguity, in some ways, a weaponization of the rule of law, to circumvent freedoms or human rights or what have you. And in some ways, in a straight out authoritarian system, maybe things are clear, that the red lines are clear, but in a kind of constitutional authoritarian system, the red lines may not be so clear. And I think in some ways, that's how Singapore in many ways has kind of operated, and to some extent in Hong Kong, this may be where we're heading in terms of a kind of constitutional framework, but underneath there's some kind of more authoritarian approach than we've had before. Just your thoughts. Sorry, I didn't mean to go on too much, but it is a topic that I've been thinking about since I was an undergraduate.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right about all those things. And I think the part of the part of the danger is part of what makes authoritarianism so hard to combat in these situations is all the things that you mentioned, and plus the using the whole idea of the Constitution as a way of legitimizing all of the authoritarian. Because if you look at a country that has a constitution, it has all of these procedures laid out, and in the case of Hong Kong, it has limited franchise, right? That people do vote for some things. Then, unless you're looking very closely, even if you're living in a society, you may not realize the ways in which actually the system is designed to be stacked against certain types of political activities, certain parts of the population, certain types of political conceptions. And so because constitutions, we just reflexively think, well, constitutions are good. Constitutions limit power, the power of the rulers, but they can be designed in lots of different ways. And that's one of the really interesting things about Hong Kong, is and in a lot of these other constitutional authoritarianisms, is the way they're actually using all of these constitutional processes to achieve what they want.
Do you think that this is an issue that Americans should be concerned about? I don't want to put you in the spot, but I mean, because some would argue that the United States constitutionalism has been in recent years threatened because there have been tendencies, or people have observed or argued that there have been tendencies towards sort of a more authoritarian approach to governance.
Yeah, so I'm of two minds of this, because one, I don't want to be overly alarmist about a 4-year administration. On the other hand, a lot of really bad things happened. So I think there is definitely cause for alarm. But I think just on the issue of the constitutional design, I think it's legitimate to ask questions about it. I know a lot of people are asking questions about the Electoral College and whether it's still a good structure to voting structure to have. I personally don't think we should get rid of the Electoral College for a variety of reasons, but it doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of loopholes in the way the electoral system is designed that perhaps should not that should be looked at. I think that what do I want to say? I think there are multiple problems here. So one is the structural problems, right? And there's structural challenges of the federal system, the Electoral College, but I think there are also lots of challenges that aren't written into constitutional design. So, for example, the ways in which parties organize themselves, the political parties organize themselves, and how they govern at the local levels. And so one of the things that's happening right now in the US is the realization that actually the local parties, local political organization is actually usually much more extreme than, say, the national organization, right? And so, so recently we've had all these local, state level, say, for example, Republican Party, the Republican Party at the state level censoring, its own members for, speaking out against President Trump and speaking out against, this election, against the election. Whereas I think the national leaders don't want any part of this, right? But they're being dragged. They are allowing themselves. I want to give them agency. They are going along intentionally with local extremism. That's a question of how the party is governed, right? And that's not a constitutional issue, but it is a political organizational issue. Right. So, but this does, so I guess the question is then how specific should constitutions be on these things? again, I think there are trade-offs, right? So the American Constitution is really fascinating for how brief it is.
Right.
Which I think is both a strength, but also we also are coming up against weaknesses. But if you look at constitutions that are much more detailed and much more specific, they don't necessarily solve all these problems. So there's a trade-off.
Right.
Yeah.
Indeed, I think this is an interesting notion, because I mean, same in the Philippines, and one of the things I discussed when I was doing research was, Constitution, after Marcos fell, they wrote a constitution rather quickly. And I think that there was a sense of urgency, and also a kind of reaction to the previous administration, or the long administration of Marcos, that resulted in a constitution that was perhaps not ideal, and where many concepts were not well thought of and thought about or thought out. And also, there's the issue of norms and conventions versus what you actually put down in a constitution. And then, of course, that opens the door to, what is interpretations of the Constitution, judicial reviews, and all that sort of thing, which we've, of course, had here an explosion of judicial review in Hong Kong. But I think this does raise the question. I mean, should countries be just rethinking and writing better constitutions? I mean, in other words, what does go into a good constitution? What is a good constitution? In the sense that something should be flexible enough, not too rigid, but how do you get the balance right? And it's a very difficult challenge.
Yeah, and I think we still struggle with this. So this is something I don't know very much about. There are a bunch of constitutional experts who work on developing constitutions. But I think it is a work in progress. You don't, and I guess my instinct, but again, so I'll tell you what my instinct is, and then why it's a problem.
Right.
My instinct is to try to leave a lot of room when you're writing a constitution, to try to leave a lot of room for development, and because you don't, again, especially when you're writing a constitution, you're necessarily at you're at a transition point in a country's history, and you don't know how things are going to turn out, and so you do want to leave room for development. Even even the US's own constitution, immediately there were 10 amendments. So, so you want to leave that room, but the danger of that is that it does require strong sense of norms and agreed upon norms. It does require a certain type of agreement about the country's ethos, its world historical mission, and what the essence of that country is. What does it mean to be that country? If you don't have that agreement, then having a wide open constitution, it's pretty easy to figure out what's going to happen. So, but I do think that you can't so it's going to necessarily require a lot of norm forming and virtue development, which is a dangerous business for states to be getting into, but that has to be there to sustain the law. Because the fact is you cannot legislate every loophole out of existence, right?
Until of course, a norm breaker comes along, right? This is the issue that's happened in the United States. And, that somebody came along and said, well, the norm must be damned, and I'm going to do things that I want to do.
Yeah, and the real test is going to be whether some of those norms under a new administration can be brought back, right? I don't know.
Interesting. Tell me about, so when do you expect your book to come out? Are you planning on next year or a couple of years?
Well, not soon enough for my editor. So I'm already late. So this, I don't know. The sooner the better. I was hoping to come back to Hong Kong last year to do some research.
Oh, right. Yes.
Yeah, coronavirus has upended all my plans. So we will see. But I hope before too long. I think, it's really topical.
Yes, for sure.
And things are also changing very quickly. on the ground. And so, so we'll see. So that.
Yeah. Now, tell us a bit about the US Naval War College. I've heard about it. I've always wondered about it. Is it what I imagine it to be? Navy officers going to college?
Yes and no. So they are Navy officers, but there are also lots of other. We do have students from all the services, and we also have some civilian students. For example, from the State Department, and right. We also have a fair number of foreign officers, and that's a big part of our program, who come and to get their degrees. So, but they aren't going to college. So these are all junior and senior officers. They've all graduated from college, and this is what we call professional military education. So they're all they're mostly getting master's degrees with us. So, so yeah, I don't know what else you might imagine. But
well, I once lectured in Canada's equivalent of it, and so I imagine it's about the same sort of thing. It seemed very plush sort of place. It was when I went to the Canada's version, it didn't seem very military, if I could put it that way. It seemed actually a rather comfortable place to be. Although I have to say, I'd never seen a lecture hall where the students were so well dressed. And
okay. Wait, so were your students do they come to school in uniform?
Yeah, they did. Well,
okay.
I gave just one lecture at the Canadian equivalent in Toronto, and they were all dressed uniforms. I was quite impressed.
Okay. Yeah, so our students actually don't come to school in uniform.
Oh, right.
Yeah, which is interesting. And it's a deliberate decision, I think, because in my department, so I'm in a strategy and policy department, and every department handles it differently, but we actually, we have a certain model of team teaching. And so you have a military professor and then a civilian professor who's a PhD in the classroom at the same time. But I think this is the same for all departments. So our military professors they can be of lower rank than some of our students. And so, which, since the military it is a very hierarchical organization, there's a lot of awareness of your rank relative to everybody else's, and a respect that is conferred as a result of that. And so I think having the students come to class in their civilian clothes helps with trying to create a more open educational environment, because we do want them to be able to talk freely and discuss things and argue with each other, and that's kind of hard when they're all in uniform.
That's interesting because when I lectured at, as I say, Canada's equivalent, I was in a suit and everybody was in everybody else, and I felt intimidated seeing everybody like. In dress uniforms, or what I thought were dress uniforms. But anyway, interesting. Now, so you're right now at Hoover Institution at Stanford, and then you're going back at the end of the summer to the US Naval War College. So tell us now, you alluded to it a little bit, what's life like been during the pandemic, the teaching, the research, I guess the lockdowns that you've had, how have you been coping?
Yeah, so I have been super lucky because I have a job. So, and I have a job that I can work from home in doing. And so in the spring, when we went into lockdown, we moved all our classes online, and the students were real troopers about that. It's kind of tough as a teacher because I think all teachers feel the same way. You really want that classroom interaction. You get more free-flowing conversation, but the students coped pretty well. But since June, I've not been teaching, and to be honest, compared to what most people are going through, it's pretty easy, right? I do my research. Right. The frustrating part is, it's hard to get resources. It's hard to go to the library, get into archives, obviously.
And you wanted to go to Hong Kong, you didn't come.
Yeah, it'd be nice to be able to do some field work. And so that's, so that's kind of a bummer. It's hard to meet people and talk about things as well. But, I am spending the pandemic in California, in coastal California. The weather's great, I can't complain. And my family believes in science, so I haven't had to deal with, yeah, worrying about family members doing
Right.
really stupid things. So I've been lucky, been very lucky.
Now we've heard reports here about the issues that Asian Americans have had to face, particularly Chinese Americans have had to face during this period, where there were racism or even just odd comments here and there. What are your thoughts and your own experiences over the past year or so? How has it been?
Yeah, so I personally, on this front, have also been very lucky. I've not encountered anything direct, so I can only speak about what other people have encountered, what's been told to me, and what I've been seeing. So, it's I guess two main thoughts. One is that this is not surprising. I think that the kind of anti-Asian sentiment should have been expected in a situation like this, where you have a pandemic, people are scared, right? And there's a long history of, of a kind of very visceral fear of viruses, and also then associating things that you dislike with viruses and disease. So there's a long history of, it's just a natural human reaction, but there's also this history of, political history, very recent political history of associating undesirable people with disease, right? And so in the context of, this pandemic, also in the context of this kind of broader geopolitical shift in US-China relations, I think has been a really bad combination. It's something, and the harm, the ensuing harm for Asian Americans, I think, should have been predicted, and we should have done a better job of trying to deal with that. Unfortunately, a lot of the rhetoric was coming from the top, from the previous administration, and so that's a hard. It's hard to combat against that. I think the hope is that, and I think so. I think the CCP has not done Asian Americans any favors by being quite
Chinese
secretive.
Communist Party, just to make sure.
Yes, so the Chinese Communist Party has not done international Asians any favors, including international Chinese, any favors by being very secretive about the coronavirus and its development, and so that has added, that has helped fan the flames. That doesn't excuse anything that's going on domestically in the U.S. All the anti-Asian stuff that's going on in the U.S. But I think there's reason to be hopeful. We do have a different administration with different rhetoric, and you see a lot of community pushback against these anti-Asian discrimination and attacks and things like that. So I think I think I don't want to say things are being handled as well as they can, but there are a lot of people who are trying their best.
Right.
Yeah.
What you say about China and the CCP, I mean, that hews back in some ways to what we talked about earlier, the issue of trust, building trust in geopolitics, building trust in communities here. Besides, that's always a very difficult thing. Where maybe you don't see the immediate impact of the breakdown in trust.
Yeah. Oh, and actually, this actually gets to an interesting point about the constitutionalism, right? Because, I mean, of course, countries lie to each other about their shortcomings. It's part of, and I think, and frankly, the United States would do a lot more lying if it could. But there are the actual constitutional protection. There are constitutional barriers to that, right? You do have a free press, and then related to the free press, you have other types of, these are not constitutional regulations, but just legal code, for example, Freedom of Information Act and stuff like this. And so actually, this political structure of the United States forces the U.S. to be more transparent than probably it would like to be, and that has some costs, but it also does, in the long run, make it more trustworthy, right? On the
And
geopolitical.
indeed, we've seen that those protections kick in the United States in the last 4 years, certainly, that there was a certain level of transparency that could not be violated. I mean, at the end of the day, because the media was still there, even though there was maybe part of the media that became a kind of state media outlet, as it were, but there was still, predominantly the media was there to provide those safeguards, and it's a big difference from say other places that we can think about. So,
Yeah.
anyway, Yvonne, this has been fantastic. I really enjoyed catching up with you because
It's been great to talk to you.
You used to have an office right across the hall from me, and now
yeah, those are the days. I miss it. I mean, I do miss being in Hong Kong. So.
Well, we hope we can welcome you back here to Hong Kong U sometime soon, and hope you're doing well. So to our viewers and listeners, let me commend Yvonne's article on AsiaGlobal Online. Come to AsiaGlobal Online and AsiaGlobal Institute websites to sign up for our email. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and listen to our AsiaGlobal podcast. So Yvonne, thank you again very much. It's lovely to see you, and keep well, and hope to see you here soon.
All right, it's my pleasure. You take care.
Yep. Bye.
All right, bye-bye.